The footprints were easy to follow at first. They didn't wander. They didn't turn. They crossed the field in a straight line, steady, deliberate, from the south fence toward the tree line at the field's upper edge. And then they stopped. Not at the tree line, 20 feet short of it, in the middle of open ground, in the middle of a stride. The last impression, a left foot pressed full into the snow, and no right foot after it. No continuation. No disturbance in the snow ahead. Asa Cole stood at the east fence and looked at the stopping point and at the undisturbed snow between it and the trees. He thought, the snow shows where it stopped. It does not show where it went. He stood at the fence for a while. The light was coming over the east ridge in the way it came in January, slow and low and cold, the sun not clearing the ridge until mid-morning at this time of year. The early light, a gray diffuse thing that showed you the shapes of objects without their details. The tracks were visible in this light as depressions in the snow, the shadows in the impressions catching the low-angle light and making the line readable across the field's full length. He could see where the line ended, and he could see the undisturbed snow beyond it and the trees beyond that. He had the specific feeling of a man who has found something and knows, in the moment of finding, that the finding is not going to resolve quickly. Not dread, something more like the recognition of a problem that was going to require time. He had farmed this land for 19 years, and he knew the quality of problems that required time. This had that quality. He climbed over and went to look. Then he went to get Nathan Birch. The lower field of the Cole farm sat at the valley's north end, a roughly rectangular piece of open ground, perhaps 300 yards across and 150 deep, bordered on the south by the county road and its fence, on the east and west by the field margins, that Asa had let go to brush over the years, and on the north by the timber, the lower edge of the ridge forest that covered everything above the valley's cultivated ground. It was a winter field in January of 1886, stripped of its corn stubble by the previous fall's work, the ground below the snow flat and open and without obstruction. There was nothing in the lower field that a person walking across it could run into. There was nothing that would cause a person to stop. The ground was level. The timber was 40 feet of open walking from the last impression. Asa Cole had been farming this field for 19 years, since his arrival in the valley in 1867 with his wife Nora and their 2 young sons. The sons were grown and gone now, one to the Western Territories, one to the city, and Nora had died 3 years past, and Asa farmed the valley land alone in the way he had come to manage most things, with the specific economy of a man who had reduced his life to what was necessary, and who had found that what was necessary was sufficient. He was 57 years old, and he knew this land in the complete way of a man who had farmed the same ground for 19 years, who had walked every foot of it in every season, and who had accumulated, across those 19 years, a relationship with the field that was less like ownership and more like familiarity. The familiarity of 2 things that had been in close proximity long enough to know each other. He knew the lower field. He knew what belonged in it and what didn't. The tracks didn't belong. He had come out at first light to check the fence on the east margin, a section that the previous day's wind had been testing, the old posts at risk of heeling over in the frozen ground. He had seen the tracks from the east fence line, the single line of impressions running north across the field, and he had read them from the fence, the way he described later to his neighbor. Slowly, from south to north, following the line with his eyes to the stopping point, and then past it to the trees, and then back again to the stopping point, and then sitting with the specific fact that the line ended where it ended. He climbed the fence and walked alongside the tracks rather than in them, The instinct of a man who had been reading ground for 19 years and who knew that the information in a track was in the track, and that putting your own foot next to it was the way to read it without disturbing it. He walked alongside the tracks from the south end, from the first impression. The first impression was at the south fence line, or just north of it, perhaps a foot past the fence, as though whoever had made the tracks had come over the fence and taken their first step into the field. He looked at the fence. No sign of someone having crossed it. No scuff on the rail, no impression in the snow on the fence's south side, where a person climbing over would have stood. Just the first impression, north of the fence, as though whoever had made it had arrived in the field without crossing its boundary. He set this aside and walked north alongside the tracks. They were regular. That was the word that kept forming as he read them. Regular in the specific way that very deliberate walking was regular, without the natural variation that most people's tracks showed even on level ground. Most people, walking across a field, showed small irregularities in their stride, a slight favoring, a tendency to veer, the natural asymmetry of a body in motion. These tracks showed none of that. Each impression was the same depth as the others, each stride the same length, the line holding true north without deviation across 300 yards of open ground. He walked alongside them to the stopping point and crouched beside the last impression and looked at it. The tracks were human, not a question. The boot print was clear and specific in the deep snow, the rounded toe, and the defined heel and the specific pattern of a boot sole pressing into snow under the weight of a person. The size was average, perhaps a man of ordinary height and build. The stride length was the stride of a person walking at a moderate pace, not hurrying, not sauntering. Walking the way a person walked with somewhere to be. The last impression was a left foot, full weight, fully pressed. Not a partial impression, not the impression of a foot that had shifted weight in the direction of stopping or turning. A full stride's impression, the foot having come down as it had come down for the preceding 40 or 50 strides, with the full forward intention of a person in mid-walk. And then, nothing. He looked at the snow ahead of the last impression, undisturbed, the surface unmarked for the 20 feet between the stopping point and the tree line, smooth and clean, the overnight snowfall having settled it and the cold having kept it since. He looked to either side of the stopping point. Nothing. He looked behind the last impression, back along the line of tracks, looking for any disturbance he had missed on the way up. Nothing. The tracks came north and stopped, and the snow around them was as the field snow was everywhere else. He looked at the right side of the stopping point, the place where the right foot should have come down, the natural continuation of the left foot's stride. He measured it with his eye. The right foot should have come down approximately 2 feet ahead of the left, slightly to the right of the line. He looked at that spot in the snow. Clean. No compression. No shadow of a lighter impression that a more careful examination might develop. Clean and flat and ordinary. He crouched at that spot for a while. The right foot was simply not there. He crouched beside the last impression for a long time. He thought, the stride doesn't change. He had seen tracks that stopped before. He had tracked deer and raccoon and fox in this field for 19 years, and he knew what tracks looked like when an animal stopped. The shortening of the stride in the last steps as the animal slowed, the settling of the weight backward, the specific pattern of deceleration that a stopping body left in snow. He had seen a man stop in snow before, too, had seen his own tracks on the mornings when he stopped to look at something, the shortened last steps before the standing impression. These tracks did not shorten. The stride was consistent from the first impression to the last. The same spacing, the same depth, the same angle of the foot, right up to the final step, which was the same as every step before it. He thought, whatever this was did not stop. He thought, it simply was not there after the last step. He stood and looked north at the trees for a while. Then he went to get Nathan Birch. Nathan Birch was the nearest neighbor, a quarter-mile south along the county road, and he was the person Asa went to when he needed a second pair of eyes on something, because Nathan had the specific quality of mind that difficult evidence required. Patient, precise, not given to reaching for conclusions before the evidence was ready to support them. He was 49, a man of moderate height and deliberate movement, a farmer who had been in the valley for 12 years. He had no particular expertise with tracks or with snow. He had the expertise of a man who paid careful attention to what he saw. He came back with Asa, and he walked alongside the tracks the same way Asa had walked alongside them, reading them from south to north without stepping in them, following the line to the stopping point. He crouched beside the last impression and looked at it. He looked at the undisturbed snow ahead of it. He stood and looked at the timber. He said, "The stride is the same." Asa said, "I noticed that." Nathan said, "A person stopping reduces their stride. Even a sudden stop. You see the shift in the print." He said, "There's no shift." Asa said, "I know." Nathan walked back along the tracks to the middle section and looked at the stride there, the regular spacing, the consistent depth, and walked back to the stopping point. He said, 100 feet, maybe more. He said, "Not one variation." He said, "Whoever made these was walking at the same pace from one end to the other." He walked the full length twice, once north, once south, looking at the tracks from different angles, the way you looked at evidence when you needed to find what you were missing. He looked alongside the tracks for any impression that might indicate a second person or an animal. He looked for disturbance in the snow around the line of prints. Nothing alongside, nothing disturbed. The field as the field was, the single line running north, the rest unmarked. He stood beside the last impression and looked north at the trees. He said, "They were going to the trees." Asa said, "That's what it looks like." Nathan said, 20 feet short." Asa said, "Yes." Nathan said, "What's at the trees?" Asa said, "Trees." He said, "The lower edge of the ridge timber." He said, "Nothing specific. Nothing that someone would be walking toward that I can name." Nathan said, "A path? Old logging track." Asa said, "Not at this point. The timber comes in here without a path." He said, "I've been over that ground 100 times. There's no reason to walk to that specific point on the tree line." Nathan looked at the stopping point, and then at the trees, and then back at the stopping point. 20 feet. He measured it with his eye. 10 seconds of walking from a standing start. 5 if you were already moving at the pace these tracks showed. He said, "The snow between here and the trees." Asa said, "Undisturbed." Nathan walked the 20 feet to the timber's edge and crouched and looked at the snow surface between his feet and the stopping point. He came back. He said, "Undisturbed." He said, "No depression, no thin ice, no hole, no feature that would explain a stop." He said, "There's nothing between that last print and the trees." He said, 10 seconds of open field. Whatever made these tracks had 10 seconds of open field left. He didn't finish the thought. He didn't have to. Asa said, "I know." Nathan said, "What time did it snow last night?" Asa said, "Finished by 10. He said, "Clear and cold after 10. He said, "Whatever made these tracks came after the snow stopped." Nathan said, "So between 10 last night and first light." Asa said, "Yes," he said, "in the dark or before first light." Nathan said, "In a field they didn't know, in the dark, walking a straight line." Asa said, "Straight line." I checked. Nathan looked at the line of tracks from south to north. The single clean path through the unmarked snow. The specific quality of a line walked by someone who knew exactly where they were going. He said, "They knew where they were going." He said, "They just didn't get there." Word reached the valley by mid-morning, moved by the mechanism that small valleys use to move things, person to person, along the roads and the fence lines, the information finding its way to everyone who had a reason to know it before noon. The settlement was not large. The lower valley had 7 farming families in January of 1886, and each family had at least one person who came to the lower field before the day was out. What they found was what Asa and Nathan had found, confirmed by each person who looked at it, in the specific way that confirmation worked when the evidence was physical and unambiguous. Not taking someone's word for it, but standing beside the last impression and crouching beside it and looking north at the undisturbed snow and the trees and making the same accounting that Asa had made at first light. The tracks crossed the field. The tracks stopped. The snow was undisturbed. The valley's explanations arrived in the order that explanations arrived in communities confronting something they did not immediately understand. First the most available, then the more considered, then the more reluctant. Jacob Mast said, "An animal." He said something large enough to make an impression that size, walking on 2 legs. He paused, aware of the insufficiency of what he was about to say. He said, "A bear, walking upright." Bears walked upright sometimes. Nathan Birch said, "Bears walked upright for a few steps, not for 100 feet at consistent stride." He said, "And the boot print." Jacob said, "The snow could have shaped it to look like a boot." Nathan said, crouched beside it and looked. He said, "That's a boot." He said it without argument in his voice, just observation. Jacob was quiet. Clara Thorne, who farmed the east edge of the valley with her husband, and who was the most practically minded person in the settlement when practical thinking was needed, said, "The snow did something odd last night." She said, "The temperature dropped fast after the snow stopped." She said, "I've seen fast temperature drops do things to a surface that looked like tracks from a distance." She went and crouched beside the impressions and looked at them for a long time. She stood up. She said, "Those are boot prints," she said. "I was hoping they weren't." She walked the length of the tracks from south to north and stood at the stopping point and looked at the undisturbed snow ahead of her. She said, "The stride." Nathan said, "Yes." She said, "Nothing in the last step. No change." Nathan said, "No." She stood there for a moment. She said, "I don't have an explanation." She said it in the specific way of a woman who was accustomed to having explanations and who was being honest about their absence, and the valley received it the way it received honest statements about difficult things, without challenge, without the forced alternative of someone who needed the account to close. Clara Thorne said she didn't have an explanation, and the valley believed her, and the valley sat with the absence of one. George Perry, whose farm was the closest to the lower field on the west side, brought his eldest son, and they walked the tracks together without speaking, and George crouched at the stopping point and was there for several minutes. When he stood, he said, "The boot is real." He said, "I've been around boot prints all my life." He said, "That is a boot print made by a person of ordinary weight, walking at an ordinary pace." He said, "It did not come from the south fence, and it did not continue to the north timber." He said those 2 things as statements of what the evidence showed, and then he was quiet. His son said, "An animal on its back legs." George said, "Walk beside it," pointed at the stride spacing. He said, "That is a human stride." He said, "An animal on its back legs does not hold a human stride for 100 feet without variation." The sun was quiet. Margaret Harlan, Harlan Webb's daughter-in-law, who had her own practical standing in the valley, walked the length of the tracks twice, and then stood at the south end looking north, and said, "Whoever made these did not hesitate." She said, "A person crossing a field in the dark hesitates. You adjust to the terrain. You check your direction. You slow when you're uncertain." She pointed along the line. She said, "There is no hesitation in there. Not once." She said, "A person walked across this field in the dark of a January night as though they were walking across their own floor." She said, "That bothers me more than the stopping." Old Harlan Webb, who had been in the valley since before any of the current farmers and who came to the field late in the afternoon, moving slowly from his cabin at the valley's north end, stood at the stopping point for a long time without speaking. He was 78 years old, and he had the quality of very old men in small communities. The authority of duration, the weight of having seen the valley longer than anyone else, and of having accumulated a relationship with it that went past what could be expressed quickly. He looked at the last impression. He looked at the trees. He said, "The field has been like this before." The valley looked at him. He said, "Not the tracks," he said, "the quality of the field." He said, "I've been past this field on mornings when it felt like this, and mornings when it didn't. And the mornings when it did were mornings when something had happened here, or was about to happen here." He said, "I noticed it, and I didn't speak of it, because there was nothing to say." He said, "Now there's something to say." Asa said, "What quality?" Harlan said, "Waiting." He said it in the flat specific way of a man choosing the right word, rather than an evocative one. He said, "The field has a waiting quality on certain mornings." He said, "Today it has that quality very strongly." He looked at the trees again. He said, "I think whatever came across this field was going somewhere it knew." He said, "I think it had been here before." He paused. He said, "I don't know why it stopped." He said after a further pause, "Or whether it did." Will Thorne went on the second day. His wife Clara had asked him not to, which was unusual for Clara, who was not a woman who asked you not to do things on the basis of unease. She said, "I can't tell you why." She said, "It's the stride. The stride bothers me more than the tracks." She said, "A thing that doesn't slow down at its last step is a thing that didn't know it was at its last step." She said, "I don't want to be on that field." Will understood what she meant, and he went anyway, because he was the kind of man who needed to put his own feet in the ground of something before he could think about it clearly. He went in the morning, after a cold night that had kept the tracks preserved, and he walked to the south end of the lower field and stood where the tracks began. He looked north along the line of impressions. The second morning had given them a quality of permanence. They had been there a full day and a night, and the cold had settled them into the snow, rather than freshening them, and they looked less like recent evidence, and more like a feature of the field, the way certain depressions in old ground looked like they had always been there. He looked at the south fence behind him, where the tracks began, or rather, where they first appeared, since they did not begin at the fence in any way that the fence explained. He had heard Asa's report about the fence. No scuff, no impression on the south side, the first track appearing north of the fence, as though the fence had not been involved in the crossing. He looked at the fence, and the fence was ordinary. He did not step into the tracks. He walked alongside them, the way Asa and Nathan had walked, and he felt the field around him the way you felt a field when you were paying attention to it, rather than working it, with the full attention of a person who was not thinking about anything else. The field was quiet. Not the quiet of a winter field in ordinary conditions, which was the quiet of dormancy, the quiet of a field waiting for spring in the specific way that worked ground waited. This was a different quality of quiet. Tighter. The sound of his own steps seemed to reach less far than they should have. The crunch of boot on frozen snow surface, which in an open field and still cold air should carry clearly in every direction, seemed to stop within a few feet of him, rather than traveling outward, as though the field were keeping its sounds to itself. He stopped partway along and stood still and listened to the silence. There was no wind. There were no birds in the ridge timber above, unusual for a mid-morning in January, when the chickadees and nuthatches that worked the lower timber were ordinarily audible from the field below. He listened for them and did not find them. He thought, the field is holding its breath. He walked the rest of the length to the stopping point and stood there. He stood in the specific place where the tracks ended, the last impression a foot to his right, and he looked north at the 20 feet of undisturbed snow between him and the trees. The trees were ordinary. He said this to himself as he looked at them. They're ordinary. They're the same trees that have been on this ridge your whole time in this valley. They are unremarkable timber on a ridge that has unremarkable timber on it. There is nothing there. He looked at them, and they were ordinary, and he also felt the specific pull of the 20 feet of snow between him and them. Not a threat, not a warning, something more like the pull of a question that had been asked and was waiting for an answer. The 20 feet felt like a question. He took one step north, then he stopped. Not because anything happened, not because the ground changed or the air changed or any physical condition altered. He stopped because the step had placed him inside the quality of the stopping point in a way that standing beside it had not. And the quality was, he would think about the word for several days before telling Clara. The quality was permission, the specific absence of it. Not hostility, not danger. The sense of standing at a place where you needed permission you did not have. He stood in that step for what felt like a long time. Then he went back. He walked back along the tracks to the south fence without looking behind him, and climbed over and stood on the road and looked at the field. Clara came out when she saw him on the road and said, "What happened?" He said, "Nothing happened." She said, "Did you go to the stopping point?" He said, "Yes," she said, "and further." He said, "One step." She said, "That was enough." He said, "Yes." He said, "It felt like a threshold, a place where the field became something else, where the ground ahead had a quality the ground behind didn't have." He said, "Not meant to be crossed, not by me." "Not that morning," she said. "It sounds like what you felt." He said, "Yes." He had not gone back to the lower field that week, and Clara had not asked him to. The valley spent those days with the question in the specific way that small communities spent questions that did not resolve, not constantly, not obsessively, but returning to it in the breaks between the ordinary work of January, in the evenings when the work was done and there was time for the kind of thinking that the work displaced. They had the physical evidence, the tracks, the stride, the stopping point, the undisturbed snow. They had what Will Thorne reported from the second-day visit. They had what Harlan Webb had said about the field's quality on certain mornings. They had the absence of any explanation that held all of these things simultaneously. They did not manufacture one. This was the specific quality of that valley in that winter. the ability to hold an open account without forcing it closed. Asa Cole had it particularly, being the person who had found the tracks and who had the most time to think about them. He sat with the evidence across those days, and he went through it the way he went through any problem that his farm produced, methodically, without skipping steps, without deciding the answer before the evidence required it. He thought about the stride. He came back to it every time, had spent 19 years in fields, and he knew what stopping looked like. The shortening at the end, the shift of weight, the thrash mark of a fall, the disturbed edges of thin ice giving way. He knew every kind of stopping he had ever seen. None of them looked like this. A stride consistent to its last impression and then simply absent was not a stride that stopped. It was a stride that continued into something the snow could not record. He thought about the fence. First impression north of it, south side undisturbed, no scuff on the rail. He thought about what that meant. The tracks began in the field the same way they ended, without a source, without a transition. Both boundaries had the same quality of incompleteness. The middle was clear. The snow had recorded the crossing faithfully, and at the edges it had either nothing to record or could not record what happened there. He stopped trying to develop it further and simply held it. Nathan Birch said to him, toward the end of the week, "What do you think happened to whoever made those tracks?" Asa said, "I think they went somewhere." Nathan said, "Where?" Asa said, "I don't know." He said, "Somewhere the snow doesn't follow." He said, "The same somewhere they came from, maybe." He said, "The tracks start at the county road and they end at the stopping point, and neither end gives me an origin or a destination that I can name." He said, "A man walks toward something." He said, "Whatever came across my field was walking toward the trees with the specific intention of something that knew exactly where it was going." He said, "It went 20 feet short of where it was going, and it was gone." He said, "I don't know if it got there." Nathan said, "The trees are still there." Asa said, "Yes," he said, "and if whatever it was came from the trees and was going back to the trees, maybe it did get there." He said, "Maybe the snow is just the wrong instrument for reading that crossing." He paused. The snow shows you the approach and not the arrival. That might be a limitation of the snow, not evidence of something that didn't happen. Nathan thought about this. He said, "That's a way of reading it." Asa said, "I'm not saying it's the right way." He said, "I'm saying the snow gave me part of the account." He said, "I've accepted that the snow doesn't always give you everything." On the morning of the 6th day, a light snow fell. Not a storm, an inch, perhaps an inch and a half, the quiet accumulation of a gray January morning, the snowflakes small and dry and coming down in the still air, with the specific patience of a winter that was not in a hurry. Asa watched it from the kitchen window with his coffee, and he watched it cover the lower field with the specific quality of attention he had been giving the lower field all week. The tracks disappeared, not at once, gradually, over the course of the morning, the new snow filling the impressions the way snow filled all impressions from the edges inward, softening the definition of each boot print before covering it entirely. He watched the individual impressions lose their sharpness, and then their depth, and then their outline, and by mid-morning the lower field was smooth, the fresh inch sitting on the old foot of snow, unmarked, the surface the same in every direction. He went out after the snow stopped and stood at the east fence and looked at the field. The field was smooth. No tracks, no impressions, no stopping point, no last left foot print 20 feet from the tree line. The snow had made the field as it had been before the tracks, clean, unbroken, the winter field that he knew. He looked at the tree line. The trees stood as they always stood. The lower edge of the ridge timber, the specific mix of oak and hickory and cedar that had been on that ridge since before he came to the valley, that would be on that ridge after he was gone. They were ordinary trees on an ordinary January morning, standing in the snow at the edge of his field the way they stood every morning. He thought about what Harlan Webb had said, about the field having a waiting quality on certain mornings. He thought about Will Thorne standing at the stopping point and feeling a threshold and turning back. He thought, the tracks are gone. The question is not gone. He thought, the field is smooth, and the trees are there, and between them is 20 feet of open ground that the snow has now covered, and I will walk across that ground this spring, and every spring after, and I don't know what I'm walking through. He stood at the fence for a while. Then the cold sent him inside. By morning, the field was smooth again, as if no one had crossed it at all. Asa Cole walked the lower field in the springs that followed. He planted it and worked it and harvested it, and every year the field was the field it had always been. In the first spring after, he found himself walking the line of the tracks when he was plowing. Following the north-south line the tracks had established, not deliberately, but because it had become a natural line through the field. He reached the north end of his first furrow and stood at the place where the stopping point had been. The snow was gone. The ground was soft and dark with spring thaw. Nothing to see. He looked at the trees. He thought, something was coming here. 20 feet short is still the closest it had ever gotten in whatever interval of time it had been trying. He turned the plow and went back south. He never found another set of tracks like the ones from January of 1886. He filed them in the part of his accounting that remained open, the things the field had shown him that he could not explain, that were true, and also without resolution. He thought, it never slowed down. Across all the years of thinking about it, that was the thing he came back to. Whatever had been crossing that field had been in the middle of crossing it right up to the moment. It was no longer there. The trees still stood where the footprints were meant to end. Because the thing about the tracks was not what was there, it was what wasn't. The right foot that should have followed the left. The arrival at the tree line that 100 feet of perfectly consistent stride had every intention of completing. The snow showed a crossing that never finished, or finished in a way the snow couldn't show. The field was smooth. The trees were there, and between them stood 20 feet of open ground that the account had never closed, patient in the way that unresolved things were patient, waiting for an explanation that the valley had decided after the 6th day's snow it was not going to receive.